Tonight, we begin not with a scream or a battle cry, but with a soft, persistent itch, not on your arm, not on your leg, but everywhere, because you're about to lie down on a medieval straw bed. There is no memory foam. There is no cotton sheet. There is no lavender pillow mist. There is, however, a pungent smell of damp straw mixed with old sweat and maybe a little manure. So, close your eyes, if you haven't already. Let's wander together into the scratchy world of sleep, circa the 14th century. Forget everything you know about bedrooms. There are no private suites, no bedside tables, no candles flickering softly next to your imported feather mattress. Instead, you're in a stone room, if you're lucky, or a wooden hut with a dirt floor and smoke-stained ceiling if you're not. The bed, such as it is simply a wooden frame filled with straw, often reused straw, stuffed into a rough linen sack. This is your mattress. It's called a pallet or tick, and it creaks. Oh, how it creaks. Every time you move, it groans under the uneven pressure. The ropes underneath, which support the sack, have slackened over time. Hence the old phrase, sleep tight, which originally meant tighten the ropes under your bed so it won't sag. But tightening ropes didn't remove the bugs. Now, lay your head gently down on a pillow, or what passed for one, often a bag of straw or hay as well, sometimes with old rags or even dried moss. The pillow smells musty. It's been used for years, passed down from parent to child. No one's washed it. Why would they? Water costs time. Soap is rare. Parasites are common. You scratch your neck, then your arm, then your leg. Congratulations. The fleas are awake. Even in castles, lords and ladies were plagued by these itchy visitors. Straw, once so fresh and fragrant when gathered from fields in summer, quickly grew damp, moldy, and filled with tiny creatures who liked it even more than you did. Let's take a step down the ladder now. You're not a noble. You're not even a well-off peasant. You're a landless laborer, the kind that rents your arms to dig ditches, haul stones, or thresh wheat. You sleep not on a bed, but on the floor. No wood frame, no rope, no sack, just straw scattered on the cold, hard ground. If you're lucky, it's not wet. And yes, you still share it. Not with your wife alone, but with your children. Maybe your neighbor. Maybe a hired boy or two. And often you sleep right next to the livestock. The goat snores. The pig twitches. The chickens roost in the rafters above your head, droppings falling like ancient snowflakes. Warmth was more important than privacy. That's why people slept together, in tight, cramped rows, like spoons in a drawer. But this wasn't romantic. It was survival. Medieval sleep did not smell like eucalyptus or vanilla. It smelled human. Body odor wasn't masked. People bathed maybe once a week. More often if they lived near rivers, less often if they couldn't afford to stop working. Beds weren't changed. Sheets, when they existed, were aired out but rarely washed. Straw mattresses were refilled only once or twice a year. So, you've got a stew of scents: sweat, animal fur, mildew, wood smoke, old cheese, and something you really hope is just mold. And this was normal. Now here's where things get even stranger. Because medieval people didn't sleep like we do. Instead of one long sleep, they often practiced something called segmented sleep. They'd go to bed shortly after sunset, sleep for a few hours, what they called the first sleep, then wake up around midnight. But they didn't panic. In fact, this was expected. People would get up, say prayers, stoke the fire, talk to each other, maybe even visit neighbors. Some would Well, engage in more private activities. Then they'd return to bed for their second sleep. Doctors of the time even recommended it. They believed this break in the middle of the night helped digestion, cleared the mind, and was good for the soul. Modern sleep scientists have since confirmed that segmented sleep may be a more natural rhythm for humans than our current 8-hour chunk. But back then, it wasn't optional. It was the only way to sleep when the night was long, the candles were scarce, and the straw mattress was only marginally better than the dirt floor. Try to imagine the feeling of this ancient sleep. You're surrounded by breathing bodies, children murmuring in their sleep, the distant cluck of a restless chicken, the snort of a cow, the wind moaning through the gaps in the shutters, and beneath your shoulders something twitches, probably a beetle. You adjust your position, the rope creaks. You itch your arm. Again. You breathe in the musk of smoke, straw, and skin. And then, somehow, you fall asleep, because for all its discomfort, it was the only sleep they knew. And in the stillness of a medieval night, no cars, no clocks, no humming fridges, sleep came not in comfort, but in exhaustion, earned, deep, and strange. When we left off, you were trying to drift off on a medieval straw bed, beneath a low ceiling of rafters, chickens above you, goats beside you, and fleas beneath you. But sleep in the Middle Ages wasn't just about discomfort. It was about beliefs, beliefs that seeped into every straw fiber beneath your back. The night for medieval people was not empty. It was not just dark. It was alive. There were no street lamps, no warm glow from phones. Once the sun set, darkness fell like a cloak, total and terrifying. And in the shadows lurked things not of this world. Witches were believed to fly at night. Demons whispered to sleepers. Evil spirits prowled the roads, seeking souls too weak to resist. People hung iron objects near their beds, like scissors or horseshoes, to ward off evil. Some placed bowls of water under the bed to trap spirits who might rise from the earth. A sneeze at midnight wasn't just a sneeze, it was a sign you were vulnerable, that something had passed near. Even dreaming could be dangerous. Dreams were messages from God or the devil. A beautiful vision might tempt you into sin. A nightmare might signal damnation. And so, people prayed before bed. They clutched holy relics under their pillow. They murmured Latin phrases, half remembered and poorly pronounced, hoping for divine protection. Because sleep wasn't just rest. It was a vulnerable silence, a time when your soul hovered close to death and anything could slip inside. Now, back to the straw bed itself. You'd think it was simply a tool for sleep, but not in the Middle Ages. Beds were status symbols. For the poor, sleep happened on sacks of straw or even bare boards. But the wealthy? They didn't just have beds. They had platforms, curtains, embroidered pillows, and carved wooden posts that reached toward the ceiling. A noble's bed was often the most valuable thing they owned. It was passed down in wills, a true medieval heirloom. And yes, even nobles had lice. But they had fancy lice. They might own multiple sets of bedding, linen for summer, wool for winter, goose feather pillows, imported blankets, a 4-poster frame with heavy drapes to block out the draft. The bed was often placed in a solar, a private upper floor room with more light and warmth. Not that they slept alone. Privacy didn't really exist in medieval times. Even nobles shared beds, with spouses, children, visiting guests, servants, and sometimes priests. It wasn't unusual for a traveling monk to sleep in the same bed as a lord, simply because there weren't enough beds to go around. Beds were warm, and warmth was life. For children, the bed was a pile of limbs, older siblings beside them, babies on top, dogs curled at their feet. And no, the dog was not just a pet. It was a heat source. Even monasteries, which prized silence and discipline, had shared dormitories. Dozens of monks lined up like stone statues, sleeping in identical robes. No pillows, no fire, just prayer and straw. And in inns? Oh, inns were chaos. Travelers of all backgrounds, merchants, thieves, pilgrims, beggars, packed into shared rooms. Sometimes 6 or 7 men to a bed, boots off, weapons nearby, each trying to sleep without being robbed. There were no private bookings, no clean sheets, only space, or the lack of it. Let's talk hygiene. Medieval people weren't dirty by choice. They washed when they could. But laundry? That was another story. Washing bedding meant dragging heavy linens to the river, scrubbing them with harsh lye soap, and hanging them to dry. In winter, that could take days. So, most people simply aired their sheets, hung them outside in sunlight or near the hearth. This helped with moisture, but not the bugs. Straw mattresses were rarely emptied. Instead, people just added more straw on top, year after year, until the mattress resembled a sediment core from a bog. And when bugs got too bad, they'd beat the mattress with sticks, trying to drive out fleas, spiders, and whatever else had made a home there. It worked. For a while. When dawn arrived, it wasn't always welcome. For laborers, waking meant returning to the fields, in rain, cold, or blistering sun. Sleep had been their only escape, and now it was over. For monks, it meant matins, the first prayers of the day before the sun even rose. They rose in silence, filed out in the dark, and chanted into stone halls echoing with cold. But even for nobles, sleep ended with duties. Letters to read, land to inspect, servants to scold, breakfasts of bread and ale to consume in dimly lit halls. There was no lounging in bed, no scrolling. The bed was not a retreat, it was just the night's place, a box for holding your body until work began again. We think of sleep as personal, intimate, but in the medieval world, sleep was communal. It was loud, it was rough, it was practical. It happened when the sun left. It stopped when the rooster screamed. And in between, you did your best. So, next time you fluff your pillow, pull your comforter up and sigh into Egyptian cotton sheets. Imagine instead the creak of ancient wood, the scratch of burlap on your skin, the faint tickle of something with too many legs crawling up your calf, the breath of someone you don't even know, inches from your ear. This was sleep, not as we want it, but as it was. Sleep was not peace. In the modern world, sleep is marketed as a luxury, a sanctuary, a kind of surrender. But for those living in the medieval centuries, to close one's eyes was not to escape the world, but to invite its darker forces inside. In the long black hours between sunset and sunrise, dreams were not private fantasies or mental filing cabinets. They were visitations, omens, portals. When a medieval person laid their body down upon a straw pallet, they knew their mind would not necessarily rest. Dreams were not random. They were meaningful, perhaps sacred, perhaps dangerous. And because people in those times lived so closely with mystery, death, and religious intensity, the night became a deeply spiritual and spiritualized space. What you dreamt might be from God, a vision of purity, a warning of future catastrophe, or a symbolic test. But it might also be from the devil, demonic temptations sent to corrupt your soul. A shadowy figure in your dream could be a saint, or it could be Satan in disguise. And how could you tell the difference, half asleep, wrapped in a flea-bitten blanket in the middle of February? The church taught that dreams could be messengers. Entire books were written to interpret symbols. If you dreamed of fire, it might mean spiritual passion, or hellfire. If you dreamed of animals, they might signify sin. A goat was lust, a pig was gluttony, a snake always was temptation. Monks and priests studied dreams not as curiosities, but as theological puzzles. Some monasteries even kept dream logs, believing certain dreams might contain revelations. But for ordinary villagers who had no education, dreams were not so much puzzles as punishments. A nightmare wasn't just a bad dream, it was often described as being sat upon. Something was on your chest. You couldn't breathe. You woke with a start, your body damp, your hands grasping for something that wasn't there. They called it the mare, the origin of our word nightmare. And it wasn't an idea, it was a creature. The mare was real to them, a spirit or even a witch who visited sleeping people and pressed down upon their chests. People would describe it in detail. A small creature with a pale face and wiry hands. A woman with hollow eyes. A goblin with long fingers and teeth like needles. It would sneak in while you slept, ride your body, drain your breath. Children described it. So did grown men. So did noble women. And because there was no science, no understanding of sleep paralysis or night terrors, there was no way to challenge this belief. If you felt it, it was real. To protect themselves, people resorted to ritual. Herbs were scattered around the bed, lavender, sage, rue. Iron nails were driven into door frames. Bread crusts, blessed by priests, were tucked under pillows. Some sewed holy words into their sheets. Others, fearing witches, placed knives under their mattresses or a Bible at their feet. The fear was not superstition in their eyes. It was preparation. The darkness was full of watchers, and sleep was the moment your body could not fight back. Children, especially, were thought to be vulnerable. Their dreams were seen as more easily influenced, their minds closer to the spiritual world. Mothers would whisper prayers into their ears as they drifted off. Let no shadow fall upon your heart tonight. They would sprinkle holy water on their foreheads. They would murmur names of saints, not because they were paranoid, but because they had seen things. Stories of children dying in their sleep were told in every village. A good child, gone without a mark, surely taken by spirits, or so they said. And sometimes people didn't want to fall asleep at all. Watchmen, monks, and sickly folk often feared what came when they let go. The moment of drifting off was described in some medieval writings as the threshold, the edge between flesh and soul. What if your soul wandered too far while dreaming? What if it didn't come back? What if a demon took its place? It sounds fantastical to us now, but this was their logic. Without microscopes, without neurology, without the firm wall of science to explain things, they relied on stories. And stories are powerful. They shape how we feel. Even today, many of us dream of falling, of being chased, of darkness and voices we don't understand. But in the Middle Ages, those weren't just dreams. They were signs, and so the bed, already scratchy, crowded, and cold, became a battlefield, not just for rest, but for your soul. To prepare, some people fasted before bed. They believed that certain foods could invite evil dreams: onions, beans, or garlic. A full stomach made you spiritually sluggish. Fasting, on the other hand, made the mind clearer, cleaner, closer to divine protection. Others, especially the deeply religious, tried to dream on purpose. They practiced what they called incubation, sleeping on holy ground, like in a church or shrine, in hopes that a saint would appear to them. They would sleep beside relics, on stone floors, wrapped in coarse robes, heads resting near altars. It was uncomfortable, but holiness wasn't supposed to be easy. It was earned. There are written accounts of people dreaming that they were visited by Saint Michael, by the Virgin Mary, even by Christ himself. These dreams were shared aloud the next day. They became stories, and those stories became the seeds of belief for others. In this way, dreams weren't private. They were communal. If you told your neighbor that you dreamed of a fire engulfing the village, he might listen. And if someone's barn burned down a week later, people would remember. Dreams became warnings, and soon people began to fear not just their own dreams, but those of others. If someone was known to dream frequently, and those dreams seemed to match events, they were watched, praised by some, feared by others, and in some tragic cases, they were accused of witchcraft. After all, if you saw the future, maybe you caused it. Even royalty was not exempt. Kings consulted dream interpreters. Emperors refused to make decisions until their astrologers had read the stars in their dreams. In a world ruled by God, every whisper of the mind might be a command. And yet, sleep still came, despite the fear, despite the rituals, despite the layers of meaning wrapped around every night's silence. People laid down. They adjusted their straw. They crossed themselves. They murmured a final prayer, and they drifted off into a realm they could not control, could not understand, and could never fully escape. Some dreams were remembered, some were forgotten, but almost all were talked about. In the morning, after the bread was eaten and the animals fed, conversations turned quietly toward the night. What did you see? Did you feel the weight? Did you hear it breathe? Husbands turned to wives, children to parents, and old women to the fire. They told each other the images, strange and half-formed, that had danced behind their eyes. A red hand in a well, a black dog at the door, a man with no face offering a candle. These were not the empty curiosities of modern dream journals. They were warnings. They were questions that needed answering. Sometimes the village wise woman was summoned. She knew the herbs. She knew the dreams. She would sit by the fire and listen with wrinkled patience. She would close her eyes. She would whisper to herself, and then she would say what it meant. Sometimes it was a bad omen, sometimes a good one. Sometimes she refused to speak of it at all, shaking her head slowly as if the dream itself was a thing that should not be named. People listened to her, not because she was magical, but because she was the closest thing to knowledge they had. And when her interpretations weren't enough, the church stepped in. Priests often warned their flocks against trusting dreams too much. They reminded them that only God sent true visions, and that many dreams were tricks. The devil was subtle. He came not as a horned beast, but as a memory, a desire, a whisper of pride. Dream of gold, and you might become greedy. Dream of flesh, and you might fall to lust. Dream of power, and pride would undo you. The most dangerous dreams were the ones that felt good. There were even cases where dreams were used as evidence. In trials for heresy or witchcraft, a person's dream could be recited as part of the testimony. If someone dreamed they flew through the night sky with a strange woman, and then their cow died the next day, the woman might find herself before a tribunal. It was not proof, but it was suspicion, and suspicion was often enough. Yet, despite the danger, people still dreamed. It was not a choice. It came with the body, with the night, with the turning of the earth and the closing of the eyes. And so they endured it. They made meaning where they could. They clung to signs. A white flower in a dream might mean healing. A broken wheel might mean betrayal. A river could be life, or death, or both. They tried to prepare themselves spiritually. Before sleep, they recited litanies. They counted blessings. They touched relics. Some even bound their hands with string to prevent sinful thoughts from becoming sinful acts in the night. Others sprinkled their pillows with powdered ash or holy salt. Some hung bells near the window to chase spirits away with sound. It was a constant negotiation between rest and risk, between peace and peril. For the truly devout, dreaming became a kind of spiritual labor. They asked not for dreams of pleasure, but for suffering, visions of martyrdom, of burning, of chains and crosses. They believed that to suffer in dreams was to be purified. To hurt in the night was to wake holier. There are accounts in old letters and sermons of people who wept upon waking, not from fear, but from gratitude. They had seen hell, and they had survived. It meant God had noticed them. It meant they were being tested. Some people even kept dream companions. They gave names to figures who appeared often. A silent woman with eyes like water, a boy who led them through mazes, a figure cloaked in wind who only pointed. These companions were not necessarily good or bad, but they were constant, and constancy was rare in the medieval world. When famine came, when plague visited, when war marched past your window, these recurring dream visitors became strange comforts, familiar shadows in an unfamiliar time. There were, of course, skeptics. Not everyone believed so strongly in the power of dreams. Some mocked those who did. They said dreams were nothing but the stomach's gases, the mind's mutterings. But even they, those loudest in daylight, admitted that sometimes a dream knew things before they did. A death, a fire, a sickness. It was enough to make them quiet the next time they went to bed. In noble households, dreams could become matters of state. A king's vision might delay a battle. A queen's nightmare might postpone a coronation. Courtiers paid attention. Some rose in status by interpreting royal dreams favorably. Others fell by saying too much. A misplaced metaphor could mean exile or worse. And so, even in marble halls and candlelit chambers, dreams held power. And still, the peasants dreamt in their huts, the monks in their stone cells, the children beside pigs and goats, the soldiers in wet tents. All of them entered that quiet darkness, that strange second world. Whether feared or welcomed, it came to them all the same. The night had its own language, its own rules. It could not be bribed, it could not be commanded, only entered and survived. And when morning came, when the light spilled in through cracks in the wall or slats in the roof, people rose slowly, some with joy, some with dread, some with the cold memory of what they had seen. But all of them knew one thing: sleep in the Middle Ages was never just sleep. There was no such thing as personal space, not in a hut, not in a manor, not even in a castle. When the sun set and the fires burned low, people gathered not just for warmth or comfort, but because they had no other choice. The idea of one bed per person was unthinkable, absurd, unnecessary. Beds were not individual possessions. They were shared spaces, places of collective survival, and often the only warm spot in a very cold world. A medieval bed, if you had one, was never yours alone. You might share it with your spouse, yes, but also with your children, who were many, and noisy, and always cold. The youngest might sleep in your arms, the older ones pressed close for warmth. There was no talk of boundaries, no corners to retreat to. If one child tossed, everyone felt it. If someone coughed, everyone heard it. If someone wet the bed, and they did, everyone dealt with it. In poorer homes, beds were even more democratic. A hired boy might sleep at your feet. A sick neighbor might be invited in for the night. A traveler passing through, known to your cousin's cousin, might be given a corner of the straw. It was not seen as strange. It was seen as hospitality, as necessity. There were no extra rooms, no couches to offer, just straw and bodies and the long night ahead. Animals, too, joined the sleep. Dogs curled between legs, cats nested in the crook of an elbow, goats pressed their sides against the outer edge of the bed. Sometimes pigs wandered close, their breath warm and sour. Chickens roosted in beams above, clucking softly in their dreams. In winter, this menagerie was welcome. The body heat of a pig could mean the difference between comfort and shivering all night long. A cow in the next room, sometimes the same room, helped raise the temperature by a few degrees. It mattered. And then there were the inns. To sleep at an inn in the Middle Ages was to surrender to chance. Beds were sold by the space, not the person. If a bed could hold 4 people, then 4 people were placed in it, regardless of whether they knew each other or not. A merchant might lie beside a farmer, a soldier beside a priest, a thief beside a pilgrim. Boots were taken off sometimes. Swords were kept close, always. Everyone lay side by side, trying to sleep while trying not to get stabbed or robbed. The beds were narrow, the blankets thin, the air thick with sweat, breath, and suspicion. In wealthier homes, things were only slightly better. A noble might have a larger bed, a finer mattress, and embroidered sheets, but he rarely slept alone. Servants often shared the bed, or slept in pallets nearby. Children might join during storms. A favored hound would not be turned away. And visitors of status were always welcome to share the warmth. Refusing to share a bed could be seen as impolite, even insulting. Bed sharing was a sign of trust, of kinship, of acceptance. There are records of political figures sharing beds, not for intimacy but for diplomacy. Sleeping beside someone was a show of equality, of vulnerability, a way to seal agreements and strengthen bonds. In royal courts, ambassadors were sometimes placed in the same bed as their host, not to test them, but to include them. A bed was more than a place to sleep. It was a symbol of connection. Of course, this closeness had consequences. Diseases spread easily. Fleas, lice, and worse traveled from body to body. Colds became family affairs. Fevers moved through whole households. And yet separation wasn't considered a solution. Togetherness was still valued more than cleanliness. The idea of sleeping alone in a quiet room would have seemed eerie, even unnatural. There were exceptions. Monks slept apart. at least symbolically. Their dormitories were long, silent halls with identical cots spaced evenly. But even here, true solitude was rare. The sounds of breathing, of coughing, of rustling robes filled the night, and sometimes monks were assigned to share a bed when space was short or punishment required it. Sleep was a discipline, not a pleasure, and even in prayer, bodies needed warmth. There were couples, of course, lovers, husbands and wives, but even marital beds were not necessarily private. Children came in and out. Servants whispered nearby. The idea of an undisturbed night between two people was unlikely. Privacy, in the modern sense, simply didn't exist. People lived in groups. They worked, ate, prayed, and slept in groups. And beds reflected that truth. Even the construction of beds told the story. Many were built to fit multiple people, not queen-sized or king-sized, but long and wide, sturdy and low. Curtains, when available, offered some sense of enclosure, but they weren't soundproof. They weren't secrets. They were veils. At best, suggestions of separation. Stories were told at night. Lullabies hummed. Fables repeated. And when sleep came, it came in layers. Light sleepers woke at every stir. Mothers opened one eye to check on coughing children. Fathers shifted to let a dog move closer. There was no silence, only the living hum of others. Even dreams weren't solitary. People murmured in their sleep. They spoke names. They cried out. And in the morning, those dreams were discussed, not as strange accidents, but as shared messages. A mother dreamed her son was falling. The next day, he stayed close to the fire. A child dreamed of wolves. That night, they barred the door more tightly. The line between personal and communal blurred. What one person felt, others carried. And when death visited, it came to the bed as well. People often died where they slept, surrounded by those who loved them, or simply those who were there. There was no hospital bed, no sterile curtain, just the same straw, the same blanket, the same closeness. The body grew cold while others still slept beside it, sometimes not knowing until morning. In this way, beds became sacred. They held birth and death, love and fever, stories and secrets, and above all, bodies. Always the bodies. There was no other option. There was no alternative. You shared the bed or you froze. You shared the bed or you were alone. And alone in the medieval world was never safe. The nights were long, and the people in the bed changed with the seasons. In summer, travelers passed through more often, seeking shelter, a floor to sleep on, a corner of blanket if they were lucky. In winter, everyone huddled tighter, pressing together until the shape of one person became lost in the weight of many. There was no such thing as keeping to yourself. The warmth of another body was as necessary as bread. Children slept in clusters, limbs tangled, heads resting on whatever part of a sibling they found first. A mother might find a baby curled against her chest and another child lying across her feet. The father, if home, would lie on the edge, keeping the draft from the door at bay. If he wasn't home, someone else might be, an uncle, a tenant, a widow needing shelter from the snow. Nobody asked whose bed it was. That wasn't the point. The bed belonged to the night. And if one cried out in sleep, the others stirred. If one thrashed with fever, the others felt it. If one whispered in a half-dream voice of something they had seen or heard or feared, the others listened. Sometimes they hushed them. Sometimes they asked questions. Sometimes they simply lay still and let the words pass through them. Dark. Nothing was fully private. Everything leaked. When someone snored, it wasn't just an annoyance. It was a kind of lullaby, familiar, constant. If the snoring stopped, people noticed. They turned to check if he was still breathing. If the wheezing began, someone might sit up, feel for a pulse. And if it ended, truly ended, the body was covered until morning. There was no panic, just a quiet understanding that someone had left the bed for good. Animals, too, were mourned in sleep. A dog who had shared a bed for years might curl up one night and not rise again. A cat might stretch, breathe out, and stay still. The space they left behind was more than just cold. It was strange. The weight of their absence lingered, and for days the sleeping shape of the bed felt wrong. There were no bedtime rituals like today, no brushing teeth, no soft jazz, no books with bookmarks waiting. Instead, there was fatigue. There was the end of a long day that began before sunrise and didn't stop until darkness made it impossible to continue. People fell into sleep like stones into water, sudden, silent, and sinking. Sometimes, though, there were stories, not told for entertainment, but for memory. A father might tell his children of a storm from years past, when the roof leaked and the animals huddled in tighter than ever. A grandmother might recall the winter when they shared the bed with a soldier too wounded to speak. A mother might sing a song her own mother sang, words half forgotten, but still carrying some warmth in them. These stories weren't written down. They lived in the straw, in the dust, in the bodies that lay close together, night after night. And not all sleep was safe. There were fights in beds, small ones, whispered arguments over who kicked whom, but also big ones, jealousies that flared, mistrust that boiled over. A man waking to find someone had taken his place, a woman waking alone again. Tempers flared in the night as easily as during the day, and there were nights when someone rose and left, preferring the cold floor or stable loft to the tension under a shared blanket. Yet they returned, always, because the night had teeth. It was better to be angry and warm than proud and frozen. Better to lie beside someone you could not speak to than to face the dark alone. In some places, people developed ways of arranging themselves. The oldest by the wall, the youngest near the fire. Men on one side, women on the other. In inns, this turned into unspoken codes. Those who snored were pushed to the end, the drunkards to the floor. The quiet ones were prized, and often found themselves invited back. There was a kind of etiquette to bed sharing. You did not talk too much. You did not move too suddenly. You kept your hands to yourself unless the arrangement allowed otherwise. You respected the boundaries that weren't marked but were understood. And if you broke them, you might find yourself sleeping outside the next night, listening to the warmth of others from behind a closed shutter. People remembered those they had shared beds with. Years later, a man might say, "I slept beside him once, in the famine winter," as if that was enough to vouch for a man's character. To sleep with someone was to know a piece of them few others did. Their smell, their sounds, the way they breathed in fear, the way they turned toward or away from the cold. These things stayed with you, and when people spoke of loved ones lost, they often spoke not of conversations or meals, but of nights, of how he always curled his knees, of how she used to mutter prayers, of how the bed felt bigger after they were gone. Sleep was where the real knowing happened. not in the light of day, but in the muffled closeness of night. Even lovers in the quiet moments after rarely had the bed to themselves. Someone else was always near, a child pretending to sleep, a cousin arriving late, a servant sleeping just beyond the curtain. Passion was fleeting, proximity was constant, and so beds were layered with memory, not just fabric and straw, but with lives stacked like sediment, each night adding another layer, each body leaving behind something invisible but felt. When beds were passed down, it wasn't just wood and rope, it was the echo of decades of breath, of dreams, of shared stillness. Today, we draw boundaries. We build bedrooms with locks. We measure square footage, count thread, test mattresses. We sleep alone or by choice. But in the medieval world, sleep was a collective act, a thing done together, messy, warm, noisy, and real. You didn't ask who else would be there. You simply made space. And when you closed your eyes, you knew. There was always someone beside you, breathing, shifting, dreaming, just like you. The cold in a medieval winter wasn't just a sensation. It was a presence. It had weight and movement and silence. It slipped in beneath doors and under thresholds, slid down chimneys and across stones. And when the sun vanished early, sometimes as soon as 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the cold moved faster than the shadows. It wrapped itself around the village, and it did not let go until spring. There was no insulation. Not really. Walls were stone or timber, with gaps and cracks and warps that let the wind speak in low whistles. Thatch roofs leaked. Shutters didn't seal. Even in castles, fire was a local blessing. It warmed one room, not the whole. The corridor might be freezing, the stairwell colder still. In the poor man's hut, there was no corridor, no rooms, just a single space, a hearth at the center. And everywhere else, the floor, the rafters, the corners, belonged to the cold. So people prepared. They stuffed gaps in the walls with moss or straw. They hung animal skins over doors. They slept in their clothes, their cloaks, their boots if needed. And still, the cold came in. It bit the fingers, burned the toes, crept across the scalp beneath linen caps. It didn't kill all at once. It stole slowly, a little warmth here, a little strength there, until one morning someone did not wake. Sleep was not escape from the cold. Sleep was a risk, because in sleep you stopped moving. You stopped shivering. You stopped being able to tell if your fingers had gone numb. So people learned to sleep in layers, wool beneath, wool above, wool beside. Families slept like knots, tangled together, arms and legs and bellies pressed close. Dogs and goats added to the pile. Every breath mattered. Every body was a candle. And still, they could not always sleep. Some lay awake, teeth chattering, waiting for the dawn. Others kept the fire going in shifts, feeding it little bits of fuel, sticks, bark, dried dung, anything that would burn. There were no unlimited logs. Forests were owned, patrolled, taxed. A single night's warmth could mean a week's worth of foraging. Fire was rationed. Heat, like food, was political. The rich slept warmer. They had fireplaces in their bedrooms, servants to stoke embers, heavy curtains to trap the warmth. Beds were built high, away from drafts. Feather mattresses insulated better than straw. Fur blankets added layers of protection. And yet, even nobles spoke of the cold, of waking with stiff fingers, of ice inside windows, of breath fogging in the air above their pillows. Their wealth delayed the cold. It didn't defeat it. The poor used tricks. They filled clay pots with hot coals, wrapped them in cloth, and placed them at their feet. They put heated stones beneath straw mats. They huddled in corners where the wind was weakest. They learned to sleep in shifts, half the family resting while the other half tended fire or took turns stomping feet to stay warm. Movement was life, stillness was surrender. Children were the most vulnerable. Their bodies cooled faster. So they were placed at the center, surrounded by siblings, parents, animals. Some mothers swaddled babies in wool and placed them in baskets near the fire, turning them like loaves so no side grew too cold. When a child died in winter, it was often in the night. And when asked, the mother would say simply that the cold took them. Dreams in the cold were different. People spoke of fire, of summer fields, of rain that warmed rather than froze. But sometimes the dreams were darker. Ice that climbed up walls, snow that spoke, a frozen hand reaching through the shutters. And always they woke shivering. Some clutched their arms, others prayed. Some simply lay still, watching the pale moonlight on the rafters, waiting for the rooster to break the spell. Even churches were cold. Monks slept in stone rooms with no heat, wrapped in habits, hands tucked beneath their robes. They recited psalms through chattering teeth, walked barefoot across freezing flagstones, and took pride in their endurance. Suffering was holy. Pain brought them closer to God. And yet, many died young, not from sin, but from cold. There were winters so long and brutal that people barely remembered warmth. Stories passed down spoke of rivers that froze solid, of carts abandoned on roads buried in snow, of wolves drawn close to villages, watching from the edge of firelight. And always, in these stories, there was a bed that felt like stone and a breath that stopped mid-sleep. Yet people found beauty too. The cold made them cling to each other. It sharpened their gratitude for little things, a warm broth, a dry cloak, a dog pressed against the small of the back. There was a kind of intimacy to surviving together, a kind of quiet strength in knowing you had made it through one more night, that you had pulled someone close and not let them go. Sleep in the cold taught them to be careful, to wake and check, to listen for the soft sound of breathing, to reach out and feel the weight beside them. And when that weight was gone, when someone slipped from the world in silence, it was the cold that had delivered them. So they feared it, and respected it, and named it. The cold was a thief, a witch, a god, a curse, and yet every night they faced it again, wrapped in straw, in wool, in hope, holding each other, trusting the darkness, trusting that they might wake. Sometimes the only way to fight the cold was to ignore it. People developed a kind of mental armor, a dull acceptance of discomfort. They stopped speaking of warmth as something expected. Instead, they treated each degree of cold like a test. If your fingers stung, it meant you still had blood. If your feet hurt, they weren't yet dead. Pain was a signal of life. Numbness was when people began to worry. That's when they shook each other awake. That's when they stirred coals even if it cost them the last dry stick. Better to be tired than frozen. Children were trained early. They were taught how to wrap their arms around their bellies, how to breathe against their hands, how to keep straw tucked tightly against the sides. They learned not to cry about the cold. Crying wasted heat. They learned to wake when the rooster crowed, even if their bones still felt like ice. Complaining did nothing. The cold didn't listen. And so they learned to live with it, even joke about it, even tells stories of winters worse than this one. Always, there had been a winter worse than this one. For those who traveled, sleep became an even greater risk. Pilgrims caught in snowstorms sometimes dug themselves into haystacks or sheltered in the ruins of barns. Merchants carried thick cloaks and bedrolls made of wool and oiled leather. They lit fires carefully, always watching for sparks that might catch in their only covering. Some tied their horses near their sleeping spot, not for safety, but for warmth. If the horse survived the night, maybe they would too. Even thieves paused their work in winter. Too cold to run, too loud to move. Footsteps on snow gave you away. So they waited. They slept in stables, in the corners of churches, in the cracks of abandoned mills. They pressed themselves against strangers and lied about who they were just to earn a few hours of borrowed heat. And when the morning came, they slipped away like ghosts. There were places, rare places, where the cold was kept at bay. Large monasteries with thick walls and deep hearths, inns built with low ceilings and packed tight with sleepers. Some noble homes had underfloor heating, ancient Roman techniques still lingering in corners of the old empire. But these were exceptions. Most of the world, most of the time, slept with the cold. The cold shaped their bodies, bent their hands, thickened their skin. It carved lines into their faces and stole teeth from their mouths. It made their movements slower, their joints stiffer, their lifespans shorter. But it also carved something else, resilience, a kind of quiet endurance that doesn't sing or shout, but simply lasts, night after night, breath after breath. There were songs about the cold, not the kind sung in joy, but the kind hummed through cracked lips as the fire dimmed. Mothers whispered them into babies' ears. Old men recited them like prayers. They spoke of frost, of wind, of sleeping saints who warmed the faithful in dreams. Sometimes the stories said that those who died in the cold were taken by angels gently, without pain, that they went to a place where the sun never set, that the cold, in the end, was not an enemy, but a gate. People believed what they needed to believe. That's how you sleep when the wind howls and your breath hangs in the air like smoke. That's how you close your eyes when the walls groan and the fire sighs and the last of the warmth has sunk into the ground. You tell yourself that spring will come, that the night is only long, not endless, that sleep is not surrender, that it is only a pause, and so they lay down, in pairs, in piles, in silence. They wrapped themselves in what they had, fur, straw, memory. They breathed together, shivered together, and dreamed of sun. There is a kind of silence that only comes when you lie on the earth itself. No mattress, no sack of straw, not even a wooden board beneath you, just soil, packed, cracked, soft in places, hard in others. It has a smell, rich and deep and faintly sour. It holds the memory of water and ash and footfall. And in the Middle Ages, it also held the sleepers. Not everyone had a bed. Beds required wood, fabric, space, things many people lacked, especially the poorest laborers, the vagrants, the shepherds, the children orphaned by plague or famine. These were the ones who slept on the floor, and sometimes that floor was just the ground. Inside homes, dirt floors were common. They were swept, yes, but only so much. Dust rose in the summer, turned to mud in winter. Sometimes straw was scattered across it to absorb the mess, to create some illusion of cushion. But it never lasted. The straw became filthy, wet, trampled into pulp. Then it was scraped out and replaced. if it could be replaced. People slept on. This floor, because it was what they had. They might place a thin woolen blanket beneath them if they owned one, or a spare tunic, or nothing. They curled into themselves, pulled a cloak tight, placed a hand beneath their head. That was sleep. No pillow, no boundary, just the ground, and the cold, and the sound of others breathing in the dark. Sometimes they shared that ground with livestock, a goat at the feet, a hen tucked in near the shoulder, a dog lying across the back. These animals brought fleas, yes, but they also brought warmth. In the calculus of survival, comfort lost to heat every time. People learned to sleep still, to move less. The ground did not give. If you rolled too far, you found stone or ashes or another body. Children learned early not to cry in the night. There was no comfort to be given, only a rough voice telling them to be quiet, to sleep, to save their strength for morning. In churches, pilgrims sometimes slept on stone floors. It was seen as holy to suffer through the cold and the hardness, to lay your bones against the body of the earth and offer your dreams to the saints above. Some claimed they felt visions rise from the floor itself, that the walls whispered, that sleep came heavy but full of meaning. Others simply woke sore and silent, grateful only that they had not been turned away. Soldiers on campaign had no roofs at all. They lay in fields, in mud, in ruined buildings among the dead. Sleep was stolen between battles, between alarms, beneath stars that offered no warmth. Some dug shallow trenches, lined them with grass or leaves, curled into the shape of their fear, and shut their eyes against the cold. If it rained, they woke wet. If it didn't, they woke stiff. The earth gave nothing, but it took. And then there were the travelers, the peddlers, the poor, the outlaws. They slept where they could, behind hedges, in abandoned mills, on the banks of rivers, under carts. Their beds were moss and stone, tree roots and sand. They used cloaks as blankets, satchels as pillows. Some slept with one eye open. Some didn't wake at all. In cities, the homeless slept on streets and under market stalls. Watchmen often drove them off. Not out of cruelty, always, but because death came easily in the night. A thief with a knife, a sudden frost, a drunk wagon driver with no time to look down. So the sleepers hid, beneath steps, inside barrels, in the cracks of places the city had forgotten. Children left alone in plague years curled in the corners of ruined homes, their backs against walls that once held warmth. They buried themselves in rags, in hay, in whatever was left. Sometimes they shared their sleeping spots with rats. Sometimes they didn't notice. Hunger took more of them than sleep ever did. But sleep came anyway, even to starving bodies, especially to them. And beneath all of this, beneath the huts and the churches and the barracks, there was always something deeper. The dead. Burial was common. Graves dug, shallow or deep, marked or unmarked. In some places, homes were built on ground that had once held cemeteries. Not intentionally, but time forgets. Villages rise, plague comes, people are buried quickly, years pass, a house is built, a floor laid down, and a family sleeps above the bones. They did not always know, but sometimes they did. Sometimes they said prayers. Sometimes they left a coin near the hearth for the ones below, just in case, because in the old stories the dead dreamed too, and if their dreams were disturbed, they might rise. So people listened. When the wind howled through a crack in the wall, they listened. When the floor creaked, though no one moved, they listened. When a child sat up and said a name that had not been spoken in years, They listened, and when they lay back down, they lay a little more still, a little more careful. They told themselves the ground was safe, that it held them, that it gave sleep just as it gave crops, that what came from the earth was honest, that they too would return to it one day. And maybe that was why sleep on the ground was never entirely restless, because the body, even in life, recognized the place it had come from. Some people preferred the ground, not because it was comfortable, but because it was simple. It didn't shift or creak. It didn't sag like rope beds or crawl with as many bugs as old straw ticks. It didn't ask for anything but silence. You lay down, and it held you. Heavy, solid, cold, but real. There were customs in certain places where the sick or elderly were laid on the bare earth in their final days. It was said the ground would draw the illness out, that the body, when placed close to the source of its making, would give up its suffering, no medicine, no priest, just soil, silence, and time. Sometimes it worked. More often it didn't. But the practice remained, because people trusted the ground more than they trusted the sky. In the summer, the ground baked. Dust rose with every movement. People coughed in their sleep, woke with mouths full of grit, but they still slept. In the winter, frost crept in from beneath, numbing the spine first, then the hips, then the legs. It became hard to wake, but they still slept. The ground was not a choice. It was the backdrop of their entire life. Sometimes sleep on the ground wasn't sleep at all, but collapse. After a long day in the fields, after childbirth, after a beating, after grief, a man would fall to his knees, then lower himself slowly, and then not rise again until morning. And when he woke, the dirt would be pressed into his skin, into his clothes, into his mouth, and he would brush it off and start again. Children played on the same dirt they slept on, drew pictures with sticks, built towers of stones, buried bird bones and broken buttons. At night they lay beside those same shapes, unaware of the line between waking and dreaming, between above and below. And not all ground was outside. Some rooms were swept, so clean that the dirt floor shone. Others were polished by centuries of feet. In wealthy homes, the floor was sometimes covered with rushes, scented herbs and reeds meant to mask the smells of rot and waste. These were meant for walking, not sleeping. But sleep came anyway. A servant, punished, a guest, forgotten, a drunk, ashamed. The floor received them all. Stories were told about sleepers who vanished into the ground. Not literally, but close enough. A woman who lay down one night and was gone by morning. Just a dent in the dust, a few strands of hair. A man who dug a hollow for warmth and was found buried beneath snow. The earth, they said, was hungry, and it remembered. In some places, people scattered salt on the ground before sleeping, not for taste, for protection, to keep spirits from rising. Salt purified. Boundaries mattered. Even on the floor, even on the earth, there were lines that should not be crossed. Others kept bits of iron under their heads, or hung garlic on strings, or left bowls of water beside them to trap the souls that drifted too low. They didn't always believe these things worked, but they did them anyway, because when you sleep on the ground, you are not the only one close to it. There were festivals where people slept outdoors together, under the stars, wrapped in blankets, laughing until their voices faded. In those moments the ground was not frightening. It was shared, a surface between earth and sky, a place to breathe together in peace. But those were rare nights. Most of the time, sleeping on the ground meant something had gone wrong or never been right. And yet, even in that lowest of places, people dreamed. They dreamed of warmth, of food, of music, of being lifted, of a bed with legs, of walls without wind, of waking without stiffness, of a night that passed without interruption. They dreamed of clean skin and silence, of being safe enough to stretch. The dirt remembered all those dreams. It soaked them in like water, held them, let them settle, and in time the ground became full of sleepers and full of longing. It was not kind, but it was consistent. It gave nothing, but it took everything gently. So when you think of sleep in the Middle Ages, don't just imagine the creaky bed or the shared straw mattress. Remember the ground. Remember the quiet bodies laid directly on the soil, the nights spent without anything between flesh and earth, the prayers whispered into cracks, the footsteps that paused, then never rose again. Because for millions, that was sleep, the only kind they knew, the only kind they had, and eventually the final kind they would ever need. Silence was rare. It was a luxury few could name, fewer still could claim. In the medieval night, sleep arrived, not with hush, but with noise. Layers of sound stacked like blankets, each one pressing down gently, constantly. You did not sleep because the world went quiet. You slept because your body gave up trying to stay awake through the music of others. First came the breathing, heavy, close, and unending, the rise and fall of chests in uneven rhythm, some shallow, some deep, some rattling through noses pinched by cold or curled with age. You learn to listen to it without hearing it, to fall into its pattern and let it pull you under. Sometimes it stopped. A pause, a silence, a fear. And then it began again, and you relaxed. Then came the snoring. Loud, unapologetic, constant. It came from your brother beside you, from your father at your feet, from the neighbor's guest who hadn't left in 3 days. Each snore was different, some soft like the pull of wool across wood, others like saws, slow and sharp. Some gurgled, some roared. Children sometimes laughed at them in the morning, mimicking the sounds at breakfast until someone told them to hush. But at night the snoring was simply part of the house. It filled corners. It made the silence less frightening. And then the moaning, from old bodies with stiff joints, from women nursing bruises, from children shifting against cold. A hand moved to scratch a bite. A knee adjusted beneath a tangle of limbs. Someone murmured a name, half dream, half memory. Someone whispered a curse. Someone else answered, or didn't. The sounds were not dramatic. They were not theatrical. They were ordinary. The human body, resting in imperfection. Sometimes there were prayers, soft, rhythmic, repeated, especially among the old, or the frightened, or the devout. Latin muttered in a broken hush. Hail Marys, said beneath breath, fingers tracing invisible crosses across chests. These prayers were not meant for others to hear, but they filled the dark all the same. A mother might whisper into her child's hair. A father might pray silently over his sick son. A widow might ask for a name to be remembered, just one more night. And still, the night continued. Outside the hut, animals added their own voices, the bleat of a restless goat, the grunt of a dreaming pig, the scratch of claws across a wooden beam, a chicken clucking in half-sleep, disturbed by something unseen. Dogs growled low in their throats, not waking, not sleeping. The wind joined in, whispering through gaps in the wall, rattling shutters, brushing across thatched roofs with dry fingers. And sometimes people cried. Not often, not loudly, but enough. A child sobbing into a blanket. A woman turned toward the wall, shaking silently. A man letting one tear fall, just one, into the straw before sleep took him. These were not the loud cries of pain. They were the quiet griefs, the ones that lived beside the body, tucked in for the night, never far from the edge of breath. And no one said anything. There were no questions, no arms around shoulders. Everyone had their turn, and everyone let it pass. Sometimes someone spoke aloud into the dark, a question, a memory, a fragment of a song. No one answered, or someone did, or someone told them to sleep. The dark was not a place of conversation, but it wasn't a place of silence either. It was a shared pause, a place where things could be heard without being acknowledged. In some places, bells marked the night. Monasteries rang the hours, pulling monks from beds to chant and kneel. The bells echoed across valleys, through woods, into the ears of peasants half asleep in their huts. Time moved differently in those hours. The bell did not wake them. It reminded them the night was not endless. In cities the sounds were different. Drunken shouts from taverns, the clatter of hooves on stone, a baby crying in the room above, the creak of carts, the scrape of rats. Even in darkness, life moved, and so did its sounds, the sounds of sleep. Like the sleep itself, were not private. They belonged to everyone in the room. One person's wheeze was another's lullaby. One person's whisper was another's warning. You grew used to it. You missed it when it was gone. Silence meant absence, an empty bed, a missing voice, a still body. And then came the worst sound of all, nothing. A space that had always made noise going quiet, a breath that didn't return, a shape that didn't move. In the morning, someone would say they hadn't heard him stir, that the snoring had stopped, that they'd waited for the usual cough, the turn, the muttered dream word, and it never came. And then the others would nod, quietly, because they'd heard it too, the absence of sound, the shape of loss. But most nights the sounds returned, familiar, worn, comforting in their imperfection, and people slept, not in silence, but in the music of their time. Some nights were louder than others. Storms made everything shudder. Rain turned thatch into a drum. Thunder walked across the hills like a god, rattling walls, slamming through dreams. People lay awake, counting seconds between flash and boom, whispering prayers, reaching for each other. Mothers held children closer. Dogs whimpered beneath benches. And in those moments every small sound inside the house became sharper. The groan of beams, the snap of fire, the shifting of someone's weight. The storm outside made the inside more alive. Other nights it was wind that ruled, not just as weather, but as presence. It howled through trees, screamed through gaps, whistled in a way that made people believe it carried voices. Some said the wind carried the dead. Others said it carried demons. A high-pitched gust could pull a child from sleep with eyes wide and trembling. Old stories came back in those hours, of witches riding through sky, of banshees wailing before death, of spirits searching for warmth. The sounds weren't just sounds, they were stories in motion. And still, sleep came, because it had to, because the body gave in, because tomorrow always came too soon. In the towns, night guards patrolled, their footsteps echoing off stone. Sometimes they sang, low, rhythmic chants to mark the hours, to ward off evil, or just to remind themselves they were still awake. Their songs drifted through shutter cracks, weaving into the dreams of those within. The rich had doors, the poor had hope, and everyone had ears. Fires talked too, even small ones. They popped and sighed, hissed at the damp wood, whispered with smoke. People listened as they fell asleep, letting the flame's breath lull them. Sometimes the fire spoke in a sudden crack, loud enough to jolt the heart. It was checked, fed, coaxed back into steady exhale. A good fire meant safety. A dying one meant cold. Its voice mattered. Babies made their own music. Even when not crying, they squeaked, grunted, sighed in tiny exhalations. New mothers half slept, attuned to every twitch, every shift. The sound of a baby not making sound was the loudest silence of all. And so sleep was light, ears half open, body ready. The line between rest and readiness blurred. Even the sick sang in their way, moans rising and falling like hymns, labored breaths, the creak of bodies too long in one place. People turned them, murmured comfort, said their names, and when the sound stopped, when the breath paused and did not return, they knew. Sometimes no one said anything until morning, but everyone had already heard. And then there were the sleepers who talked, not just muttering, but speaking in full voices, sometimes laughter, sometimes warnings, sometimes names no one recognized. Sleepwalkers, too, moved in the dark. Doors opened, steps creaked. A figure passed in the moonlight, eyes open but blind. They were guided back gently. If they were touched too roughly, it was said their soul could be lost. So people were careful, quiet, gentle. Some homes had a rhythm to their nights, the same snores, the same coughs, the same midnight prayers, like a familiar song played differently each night, but always recognizable. When someone new came to sleep, a cousin visiting, a hired worker passing through, they added their voice to the mix. And when they left, the absence echoed. In monasteries, sound was structured. Bells rang, chants rose. The night was divided into watches, and each watch had its sound. Silence was practiced, but never total. Cloth rustled, feet padded across stone. Psalms floated through air that never fully warmed. The brothers moved like shadows, their voices soft but steady. Their prayers filled the dark like breath. In the woods, away from homes and hearths, sleep was different. The night sang louder. Owls called. Foxes yelped. Branches cracked beneath unseen feet. Travelers wrapped themselves in furs and fear, listening for what might come. Sometimes it was nothing. Sometimes it was worse. Wolves, men, spirits. Every rustle carried meaning. No one slept deeply under trees. The forest had its own rules, its own choir. But for all the sounds, people did sleep. They slept through snoring and muttering, through wind and fire, through whispers and weeping. The body, tired, claimed its right, and the mind, even if restless, eventually gave in. They slept not because it was quiet, but because quiet was never expected. They slept because they had learned to live inside the sound, to accept it, to carry it, to be part of it. So when you imagine a medieval night, don't imagine silence. Imagine the song, the one sung without melody, without beginning or end, the one made by breathing, by praying, by dreaming, by living, all together, in the dark. Some people slept with their backs to the room, not because it was more comfortable, but because they didn't want to be seen. The night was full of eyes, real ones, remembering ones, judging ones, and so the safest direction was away. In the medieval world, not everyone could afford to be known. Identity was fragile. Your name could be whispered or lost or stolen. A mistake, a rumor, a wrong word heard by the wrong ear. Any of those could unravel a life. So when night came and sleep approached, many people wore a different kind of mask, not on their face, but in how they lay, how they hid, how they tried to disappear. Some wrapped themselves too tightly, blankets pulled high, cloaks folded double, not just for warmth, but for hiding. They slept curled, as if expecting to be struck. Others refused to remove their hoods, even under the same roof for days. They claimed cold. They claimed habit. But everyone understood. There was something underneath they didn't want others to see. For some, it was a scar, a wound left by war or punishment or accident. For others, it was disease, a jaw that no longer aligned, skin marred by pox, eyes too bright or too clouded. In a world where sickness marked the body quickly, and healing left few traces of grace, many bore faces they were ashamed of, not because they had done wrong, but because the world had decided to look away. Some wore shame like a second skin. They didn't need visible marks. Their guilt glowed beneath the surface. A mother who had lost a child, a man who had fled battle, a woman who had spoken back once, too sharply, and paid for it with silence from everyone around her. They slept quietly, carefully, always on the edge of space, always last to close their eyes. There were others who couldn't sleep unless someone else did first. They waited, watching, listening for steady breaths. Only then did they allow themselves to sink into the darkness, not because they feared being seen, but because they feared what might be done to them if they let go too soon. Sleep was vulnerability, a nakedness more dangerous than flesh. And so people learned to feign sleep, to lie still, to breathe evenly, to listen even while resting. It was a skill, especially in inns, especially on the road, especially in places where no one knew your name and everyone seemed to know your secrets. There were runaways, serfs who had escaped their lords, apprentices who had broken contract, women fleeing betrothals, men avoiding debts. They took new names, told half-truths, kept their backs to the wall and their faces in the dark. Sleep was brief, untrusting, shallow, and there were those who disguised not their names but their hearts. Lovers caught in the wrong bed, friends sleeping beside each other too closely, but never speaking of it. A glance across straw, a brush of hands, nothing said, everything felt. Sleep became a theater, a performance. They lay as they were expected to lie, and dreamed what they dared not live. Monks, too, had faces they couldn't show, not always to others, but to themselves. They were taught to banish dreams, to resist temptation, to sleep without desire. But the mind is not so easily commanded. So they woke in guilt, whispered confessions in the morning, sought forgiveness in prayer and penance. Their shame was wrapped in silence. Even among nobles, the bedchamber was not always safe. Court was full of masks, smiles over daggers. Sleep might bring dreams of betrayal, memories of past missteps, or visions of futures already feared. So they slept with knives, with locks, with guards outside and doubt inside, and they rarely slept well. Children sensed all of this. They watched their parents' faces before sleep, noticed who turned away, who stayed awake longest, who never slept at all, and they learned to hide their own fears, to bury their questions, to wrap themselves in the same silence. The world outside judged people by their faces. The world inside the night did too, but it was quieter about it, more patient, more permanent. Once you closed your eyes, you could be anything, or anyone, but only until morning. And when dawn came, and faces were revealed again in the gray light, the performance resumed. Sleep had changed nothing, or perhaps it had changed everything, but no one said a word. They simply rose, adjusted their cloaks, looked away when needed, and carried the weight of the face they still couldn't show. There were nights when someone would speak in their sleep and say too much, a name they shouldn't know, a word in a language they weren't supposed to speak, a plea for forgiveness that no one had asked of them. And in the morning, they would rise quickly, eyes low, brushing dust from clothes that weren't dusty. People remembered those murmurs, not always the words, just the tone, the tension, the edge, and they acted accordingly. Some were banished from beds without being told. One night they were offered a corner of straw. The next night they were pointed toward the stable. The excuse might be space, might be sickness, might be nothing at all. But the message was clear. Someone had heard too much, or seen what wasn't meant to be seen, and the bed was no longer safe. There were rituals for hiding, tiny, quiet ones, a scarf wrapped just so, a bit of charcoal smudged along a jawline, a coin tucked beneath a tongue. Not magic, not superstition, just an attempt to hold on to something, to control the image even when asleep. You couldn't control what people saw while you dreamed, but you could control the shape of your stillness, the way you folded your arms, the direction you faced, whether your boots stayed on. Some people slept with a hand over their face. Others pulled their hoods low, even indoors. Others lay inside their cloaks like they were being buried. These gestures went unspoken, but they were seen, and the people around them learned not to ask. Questions were dangerous, answers more so. In certain villages, there were stories of sleepers who changed at night, not into beasts or spirits, but into their true selves. Faces that blurred, voices that shifted. They would speak with tongues not their own, wake up with bruises they could not explain. Parents warned their children not to look too closely at night. Let sleepers be. Let the dark hold what it chooses. There were people who claimed to forget who they were in their sleep. Not dreams, but erasure. They would wake and stare blankly at those around them. Ask questions a stranger would ask. Then slowly remember, or pretend to. No one was sure. Some believed these were tricks. Others believed they were curses. Most just kept their distance. And then there were the sleepers who had no name at all. No home, no kin, no one to vouch for them. They arrived at the edge of town with calloused feet and a borrowed story. They worked for food, ate in silence, and when the sun went down, they found a barn or a porch or a bare patch of earth and lay down without asking. If they were lucky, someone offered them warmth. If not, they kept moving. These were the people who never fully belonged to the bed. Their presence was temporary, their breath unfamiliar. And yet, for a few hours they shared the same space, the same sky, the same straw, until morning. Then they left, or were made to leave. In the castles, even masks wore masks. Courtiers smiled across tables, then clenched their teeth in bed. Sleep became a pause between lies. No one trusted dreams, too revealing, too real. Some drank before sleep to silence the mind. Others repeated mantras, words that didn't mean anything but created a wall. Some had nightmares so often they no longer reacted to them, just turned over and waited for it to pass. A few tried not to sleep at all. They paced, prayed, sat with their backs against cold stone. But sleep always came, eventually. And when it did, It came with everything they had buried, faces they had forgotten, faces they wished they could forget. And in the dark, they couldn't help but wear them. For some, sleep was a rehearsal, a place to try out a version of themselves they could never show in daylight. A gentler voice, a louder laugh, a name they hadn't heard since childhood. They didn't control the dream, but in the dream, they felt real, whole, free. And when they woke, it hurt more than the straw or the cold, because the dream had been the truth, and the day was the lie. But no matter who they were, or who they pretended to be, they all lay down the same, on floors, on pallets, on dirt, on beds carved from oak and lined with fur. They turned their faces toward the wall, toward the fire, toward nothing, and they closed their eyes. Some dreamed, some didn't remember, some couldn't forget. But all of them, in one way or another, slept as someone they weren't allowed to be. And when morning came, they rose and put the face back on. There are nights when cold creeps, and there are nights when it strikes. In the deep winters of the medieval world, there were nights when breath froze in the air and clung to skin like frostbite in waiting. When walls groaned, when thatch cracked, when silence no longer meant stillness, but surrender. These were not the long, slow chills of autumn or the quiet, damp cold of spring. This was the cold that burned. People spoke of it with reverence, as if it were alive. It came down from the hills, they said, from the north, from God, or from something older. It slid over rivers like a glass blade and hunted in the alleys of stone towns and the cracks between village homes. You did not feel it arrive. You felt it claim. The first sign was the air inside the mouth. It hurt to breathe. Each inhale scraped the back of the throat like iron filings. Then the fingertips, slowly, went gray. Then the toes. Then the joints, stiffening like gates long rusted. People pulled their limbs tighter, curling inward, folding into themselves. But the cold found every crease. Children were the first to cry. The sounds thin and sharp, swallowed by the walls. Mothers whispered and held them, wrapping small bodies in everything they had, shawls, rags, sleeves torn from their own garments. Some children slept anyway, their exhaustion stronger than the chill. Others simply whimpered until the air took the strength from their voices. Men sat by fires that had no heat left, embers glowing without warmth. They stared, not at the flames, but past them, at walls, at corners, at the shape of the breath hanging before them like fog that refused to fade. They did not speak. There was nothing to say. The cold had taken speech too. Animals huddled in corners. Dogs crawled beneath beds and shivered. Goats cried softly in the dark. Chickens stopped clucking. Even the rats moved slower. Everyone knew what that meant. When the rats stopped moving, the cold was inside everything. There were beds that didn't survive the night, beds that became tombs, people frozen where they lay, their last expressions caught somewhere between sleep and confusion. No scream, no shift, just stillness. The kind of stillness that even warmth could not unmake. Sometimes a whole family was found in a morning, still locked together, a tangle of arms and faces so tightly wound you could not see where one body ended and the next began. They had tried to hold in the heat, and instead they held each other into the grave. Not every house had wood. Not every house had fire. Some burned furniture. Others tore roofs for kindling. A door was just a piece of wood when the night was trying to kill you. Walls were sacrificed one plank at a time. A home could be rebuilt, a breath could not. People whispered of those who never felt the cold, the old ones who lay down smiling, the ones who claimed to see light in the frost. They said that if you gave in gently, the cold gave you dreams, that the pain went away just before the end, that it carried you like sleep, soft and distant. But no one could know for sure, and no one wanted to test the kindness of the frost twice. Clothes became armor, layers upon layers, stitched and pinned and bound until movement was almost impossible. Sleep came in stiff poses, no turning, no rolling, just lying there, heavy with wool and hope, and still the cold seeped through. No matter how many layers, the night always found a seam. In monasteries the brothers shivered through prayers, their voices trembling, their fingers blue around candle holders. And still they recited, because stopping would have meant admitting weakness. They kept vigil, not just against sin, but against the creeping frost that came for their bones. Some whispered psalms through chattering teeth. Others prayed in silence, saving breath. In cities, people packed together. Whole families, even strangers, taking turns sleeping in shifts near a single coal brazier. The rich locked shutters and piled on furs. But even they could not keep it out entirely. Stone held cold like memory. Marble never softened, and fire only reached so far. The cold didn't kill only at night, but night made it easier. No movement, no distractions, just long hours, no sun, no sounds, just breathing, and eventually, not even that. And still, every evening, people lay down again, knowing what the night might bring, knowing that their dreams might never come, knowing that warmth was a memory and spring was a promise made by people who didn't have to sleep on stone. They lay down because there was nothing else to do, because the body asked for rest, even in danger, because sleep was the last comfort the world allowed them. And if the cold came, they would face it, as they did every night, with arms wrapped around children, with coals cupped in clay, with prayers breathed into scarves, and silence always, waiting on the other side. There were no numbers to count the ones the cold had taken, no ledgers kept in poor villages, no markers placed for those who died between days. Sometimes they were buried, sometimes not. Sometimes they were simply gone by morning, and the others kept moving, because the only thing colder than the ground was standing still. In some homes there were customs. If someone died from the cold, you didn't say their name until the thaw. You covered the body in straw or in cloth and placed a piece of bread by the mouth in case the soul was hungry. You lit no fire that day. You saved the heat for the living. And if the body had to stay inside the house for days because the ground was frozen too hard to dig, you didn't look at it. You didn't speak to it. You pretended they were just sleeping a little longer than the rest. When it was too dangerous to sleep, people did not sleep. They sat up, rocking slightly, whispering to themselves to stay awake. They told stories. They played small games, pressing hands together and pulling them apart to feel the blood flow. They chewed on dried herbs to keep the jaws moving. And still, the cold asked them to lie down. Promised rest. Promised it would be gentle this time, that it would feel like nothing at all. Some believed that the cold was punishment, a reminder, that comfort was pride, that pain was the price for life. They said God made the winter harsher when the people had grown soft, that only the faithful would be spared, that if your breath froze, maybe your heart had frozen first, And so some bore the cold like penance, as if by suffering it they were proving something to God, to others, to themselves. Others cursed the sky, cursed the land, cursed the air itself. They pounded walls with frozen fists and howled like dogs, not because they expected help, but because it felt like the only thing left to do. And when their voices broke, they lay down again, because shouting never made the air warmer, and rage couldn't build a fire. Children asked questions adults didn't answer. Why does it hurt to breathe? Why did the goat stop moving? Why is mother sleeping with her eyes open? And the adults said things that weren't lies, but weren't true either. She's just resting. The goat is tired. The cold will pass. It always passes. You just have to sleep through it. But not everyone did. There were ways to trick the cold, or so people believed. A clove of garlic rubbed on the soles of your feet, a sprig of thyme placed beneath your tongue, a circle of ash drawn on the floor around the bed. Some even left one shoe turned backward by the door to confuse the cold, so it wouldn't know which way to come in. None of it worked, but it helped. It gave shape to the helplessness. It gave people something to do with their shaking hands. The rich bought warmth, blankets made of imported wool, coats lined with fur, servants to feed fires while they slept. And even then, some died, because even gold burns away when the wind finds a crack. Even kings cannot command the weather, and even the finest feather bed turns hard when the body inside it no longer stirs. In the deepest parts of winter, people stopped talking about the cold. It was always there. To name it was to invite it closer. So they spoke of food instead, of spring, of a warm summer years ago, of apples so ripe they burst in the hand, of rivers that ran warm and sweet. They told these stories at night, not to teach, but to distract. So the children could fall asleep thinking of sunshine, even as ice formed in their hair. And sleep did come somehow, even then, even with knees drawn to chests and hands tucked under armpits, even with teeth clenched and feet too numb to feel, even in rooms where frost climbed the walls like vines, because the body has a limit, and when it reaches it, sleep is the final rebellion, or the first surrender. There were those who made it through, who woke up sore and stiff and alive, who coughed into their palms and checked their fingers for color, who rubbed warmth back into their legs, who rolled over and touched the person beside them and felt breath, and thanked something, God, luck, fire, straw, that they were still here. And there were those who didn't, and the rest did what they had to do. They took the bodies outside, or not. They said prayers, or not. They cried, or didn't. And that night they lay down again, not because it was safe, not because it was warm, but because the night was long, and the fire was low, and the cold had not yet finished singing. The smell lingered. It was the first thing they noticed when they returned, if they returned at all. Long after the fire was gone, after the embers had cooled and the sky was no longer red, the scent remained. It clung to the stone, to the soil, to the surviving walls, blackened and flaking. It settled in the straw, in the fabric, in the hair of children who hadn't spoken in days. The whole village smelled like ash, and somehow they were supposed to sleep in it. Fire came to medieval towns without warning and without mercy. A knocked candle, a drunken spill near the hearth, a careless spark in a dry season, then wind and wood and screams. By the time anyone woke, it was already too late. thatch roofs lit like paper, walls fell inwards, beams cracked like thunder. People fled barefoot, holding children or dragging carts or carrying only a name and nothing else. And when it ended, when the smoke finally slowed and the air stopped glowing, they stood on ground that no longer felt like theirs. The village was not dead, but it had changed. It was quiet in a different way. The animals gone, the people hollow, the color drained from everything. There were no songs, no laughter, just tasks. Someone had to gather wood. Someone had to check the bodies. Someone had to clear what remained. But no one talked about sleeping, because the fire had burned more than homes. It had burned the place sleep came from. For days, people sat up at night, not from pain, though pain was there, not from cold, though the cold had returned, but from fear, not of fire, but of what they might see when they closed their eyes. A roof collapsing, a scream caught in smoke, the moment they turned back and saw nothing left. Sleep became dangerous, too close to memory. Some tried. They lay in the ashes of their homes, wrapped in whatever they had managed to pull from the flames. A burnt blanket, a scorched tunic. They pulled it over their heads and lay down next to the ruins of what used to be their beds. The earth still warm beneath them, still dry. But the warmth felt wrong, like something stolen, like the breath of a God who didn't care what he had just done. Children cried in their sleep. That wasn't new, but now they woke crying, reaching out for mothers whose names were not being said, for dogs that had not been found, for toys now melted into unrecognizable lumps. They dreamed in fire. Even when the sky was clear, their minds glowed orange. Some mothers refused to sleep at all. They sat with backs against what was left of a wall, staring out at nothing, arms wrapped around whatever they hadn't lost. They blinked slowly, breathing shallow, rocking slightly. They weren't praying. They weren't even waiting. They were simply there, because sleep felt like another fire they didn't have the strength to run from. People who used to share beds now slept far apart. No longer tangled for warmth, they drifted into the corners, the same straw, the same shelter. But space had grown between them. Guilt did that, and grief. Each person had lost something different, and they didn't know how to speak across those distances. So they slept in silence, facing away. The night no longer felt like rest. It felt like retreat. They closed their eyes, not because they wanted to, but because their bodies couldn't hold themselves upright anymore. They collapsed into exhaustion, not sleep. And in the dark, the smell of ash filled their lungs again. Some covered their faces, not for cold, but to block out the scent. Others filled sacks with herbs, clutching them like talismans. It didn't help. The fire lived in the walls of their noses now, in their dreams, in the very shape of their breath. And still, the day came again. Another sunrise, colder than the last. Another sky pretending nothing had happened. Another round of chores, rebuilding, salvaging, pretending. But the nights remained unchanged, dark, quiet, and full of ash. They didn't talk about the dreams, but they all had them. Some dreamed of fire that never stopped spreading, others of hands they didn't reach in time, others of houses still standing, untouched, and woke crying, not from fear, but from hope. And when someone finally said, "I didn't sleep last night," no one replied, because none of them had. When people began to rebuild, they didn't rebuild their beds first. They made walls, roofs, fences for animals they no longer owned, places to cook if they had anything left to cook. But beds? Beds could wait. Straw on the ground was enough. No one wanted to lie too comfortably anyway. Not yet. It felt wrong to rest too well when others had not woken at all. There were places people avoided sleeping altogether. The center of the village, where the fire had burned hottest, the space where the chapel had once stood, the corners where bodies had been found. Even if the ashes were cleared and the soil tamped down, there was something in the air, something that made the skin crawl. They didn't speak of curses or ghosts. They just moved their sleeping spots somewhere else. Even months later, when roofs had returned and fires burned in hearths again, the nights stayed uneasy. People turned over more, coughed into the dark, sat up without knowing why. Some woke suddenly, gasping, convinced they smelled smoke. Others reached for loved ones who were no longer there. And some stayed perfectly still, eyes wide open, listening for sounds they knew would never come back. The fire had taken more than wood and flesh. It had taken trust, in walls, in sleep, in time itself. No one believed any more that the night would leave them untouched. So they prepared differently. They kept buckets near the door. Sleepers took turns tending fires. Someone always remained half awake, staring into the glow, not because it helped, but because it felt like action. And in a world where fire had already won once, action was the only comfort. Children began to sleep in pairs again, but tighter now, not just for warmth, but for proof that someone else was real, that if something happened again, someone would shake them awake this time. Mothers touched their children's faces in the dark, not out of fear they would go, but because they already had once, in a dream, in a fire, in something in between, and she needed to remind herself they were still here. Fathers stopped telling stories, or when they did, the stories had changed. No more tales of dragons and far-off kings. Now they spoke of rebuilding, of trees still standing, of neighbors who had returned, of bread rising again after so much hunger. These weren't stories meant to entertain. They were stories meant to anchor, to steady the mind against the night. Some spoke of fire like it was a thing with thought, not a tool, not an accident, but a visitor, a traveler who passed through when you weren't looking and took what it liked. The fire came, they would say, as if it had walked through the fields and chosen the door. It gave it agency, and somehow that made it easier. You couldn't be angry at something with no name. There were those who refused to speak of it at all. They slept in silence, worked in silence, dreamed in silence, and when they cried, they turned their faces to the wall and let the ash in the air swallow the sound. Others tried to forget, moved to another village, married again, built homes with thicker walls and never mentioned the first one. But forgetting is a kind of fire too, and it leaves its own smoke. Years later, the village no longer smelled like ash, but the people still did. It was in their clothes, in their voices, in the way they looked up whenever someone shouted, in the way they hesitated before blowing out a candle, in the way they touched the walls at night just to be sure they were still cool. They still slept. Of course they did. The body always finds a way, but it was a different kind of sleep now, one that came slower. That ended earlier. That held its breath between dreams, and when they dreamed, it wasn't always of fire. Sometimes they dreamed of rain, of rivers rising, of stone that did not burn. But even in those dreams, they always woke up sniffing the air, just to be sure, because once you've slept in ash, even peace smells like smoke. Not everyone slept. Even in the deepest nights of the medieval world, even when the house was still, the wind soft and the animals quiet, someone stayed awake, not because they wanted to, not because they feared sleep, but because someone had to. They were not always appointed, not always named. Sometimes it was the oldest, sometimes the strongest, sometimes just the one who couldn't sleep anyway. So the others said nothing when they sat near the door, back to the wall, staring into dark that didn't stare back. The night watcher had no armor, no torch, no oath, just eyes and ears and time. They sat while the others breathed, counted the slow rise and fall of bellies beneath blankets, watched straw shift and settle, noticed who whimpered, who turned, who whispered names of people long gone. They kept the fire from dying, tapped embers, fed it slivers of wood, sometimes nothing more than bark. The flame stayed small, quiet. It didn't need to chase the shadows, just hold them where they were. Outside, things moved, not always threats, but not always nothing. The snap of a branch, the crunch of frost, the whimper of a fox, or the hush of a footstep too careful. The watcher didn't rise, didn't call out, just listened and waited. Their job wasn't to fight, it was to notice and to wake the others if waking was needed. Some watchers prayed, others sang quietly, some whispered to themselves to stay awake, anything to mark time, because time moved differently at night. It stretched, it frayed, it turned on itself. An hour could feel like half a day, and dawn always arrived slower when no one else could see it. Sometimes they nodded off, for a breath, a blink, a moment, and snapped back with guilt sharp in the ribs, because they had heard too many stories, stories of the watcher who slept too deeply, who missed the spark, the thief, the scream, the cold wind that slipped in and never left. So they sat up straighter, rubbed their face, and watched again. There was comfort sometimes in the task, the steadiness of it, the purpose, the way the silence became familiar. They memorized the sounds of sleep, the tiny differences in each person's breathing. They could tell who was dreaming, who was restless, who would wake soon. They became fluent in stillness, and sometimes, in that silence, things appeared. Not real things, not always, but shapes in corners that hadn't been there before, faces in the fire's edge, a sound that came from inside, not outside. They blinked, waited. It faded, or it didn't. They didn't tell the others. What was the point? The watcher's job wasn't to be believed. It was to watch, to see, even when no one else wanted to, even when the seeing changed you. They saw the baby who stirred just before the fever returned. They saw the husband who turned away from his wife and cried. They saw the boy who muttered apologies in sleep. They saw the widow who mouthed a name again and again. They saw everything that sleep was supposed to hide, and still they didn't speak. Sometimes the same person watched every night, not because it was their duty, but because sleep had left them behind long ago. Because once you watch enough nights, the day no longer feels like yours. You belong to the dark, to the slow drift of time, to the sounds no one else hears, to the movements no one else sees, to the moment just before the rooster cries, when everything is still, and you are still there, breathing, waiting, watching. The ones who watched weren't always remembered. No ballads were sung for them. No lines written into church records. No monuments raised to honor the person who sat beside a crumbling wall for hours while the rest of the house drifted through dreams. But they were there, night after night, and something about their presence made the sleep of others deeper, even if no one knew it. Sometimes it was a mother, keeping her hand on her child's chest to feel it rise and fall. Sometimes it was a brother, sitting by the door after fire had once come through it. Sometimes it was a stranger, passing through for one night, who volunteered without being asked. And sometimes it was no one at all, no one assigned, no one aware. But still, someone stayed awake, not because they were brave or strong, but because they couldn't close their eyes. The line between duty and burden blurred. The watcher didn't always want to be the watcher. They just became it. Sleep slipped away from them long ago, taken by grief or guilt, or the need to always be ready for something that might not happen. And what they saw, they carried. The shape of a child's hand twitching, the frost forming on the edges of a sleeping man's beard, the way a woman whispered someone else's name when she turned in her sleep. They never told, because the watcher's job was not to speak, it was to remember, to hold those things in the silent hours so the others didn't have to. Some watchers passed their nights carving small things, wood chips turned into beads, crosses, meaningless shapes, not for beauty, just to mark the minutes. Others counted breaths, listened for patterns, waited for a sound that would break the spell of stillness. And sometimes that sound came, a horse approaching, a scream far off in the woods, the hiss of a spark in dry straw. And then the watcher moved, fast, woke the others. Saved them, maybe, or didn't. But either way, they had been the one to see it first. Most nights, though, nothing happened. The wind moved, the fire sighed, and the sky, black and eternal, pressed down on everything. Some watchers made peace with it, others didn't. But still they watched, even when their eyes burned, even when their limbs went numb, even when they wished more than anything for sleep. Because if they slept, who would see? Who would hear? Who would be the one left to carry the weight of what the night could bring? So they stayed, and when morning came, they didn't speak of what they saw. They simply nodded, stood up, stretched, and went about their day like the rest, as if they had slept, as if they had dreamed, as if the night hadn't passed through them like a wind that carried everything and left nothing.